there's a version of you that exists only in your mind. A carefully crafted story about who you are, what you believe, and why you do the things you do. But what if that story is mostly fiction? What if the psychology of knowing yourself is less about discovery and more about dismantling the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself for years? Most people go through life thinking they know themselves pretty well. They can list their favorite foods, describe their personality, explain their values. But self-knowledge isn't about surface-level facts. It's about understanding the invisible architecture of your mind, the patterns you can't see, the motivations you'd never admit, the parts of yourself that only show up when no one's watching. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The person you think you are and the person you actually are might be living in completely different worlds. One version exists in your internal narrative, polished and reasonable. The other version shows up in your actions, your reactions, the things you do when you're tired or scared or angry. Knowing yourself means closing that gap, and most people never even realize there is one. Think about the last time you did something that surprised you. Maybe you snapped at someone you care about. Maybe you made a choice that went against everything you claim to believe. In that moment, a stranger showed up wearing your face. That stranger is you too, the real you, the one that exists beneath the story. And if you want to truly know yourself, you have to be willing to meet that stranger without flinching. The psychology of self-knowledge starts with a simple question. Are you watching your thoughts, or are you drowning in them? Most people never learn the difference. They experience a constant stream of feelings, reactions, judgments, and assume that stream is who they are. But consciousness isn't the thoughts themselves. It's the space where thoughts appear. It's the quiet observer sitting behind your eyes, noticing everything without being swept away by any of it. This is what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, to step back from your mental noise and observe it like you'd watch clouds moving across the sky. And this skill changes everything, because once you realize you can watch your thoughts, you're no longer trapped inside them. You can see a feeling rise without becoming that feeling. You can notice a pattern without being controlled by it. Your mind is an ecosystem, not a single voice, but a complex network of impulses, memories, fears, desires, all competing for attention. Some parts of you want safety, other parts crave novelty. Some parts are trying to protect you from pain you experienced years ago. Other parts are pushing you toward growth even when it's terrifying. And most of the time, you're not conducting this orchestra. You're just letting the loudest instrument take over. But when you develop the ability to observe your internal world, something shifts. You start to see the patterns. You notice that certain thoughts show up in specific situations. You recognize when old wounds are driving current decisions. You catch yourself repeating behaviors that don't serve you. And instead of judging yourself for it, you get curious. Why does this keep happening? What need is this trying to meet? What part of me is scared right now? This kind of awareness doesn't come naturally. It takes practice. It requires you to slow down in a world that rewards speed, to sit with discomfort instead of reaching for distraction, to ask questions that don't have easy answers. But this is where real self-knowledge lives, not in the stories you tell about yourself, but in the willingness to examine those stories without defending them. And then comes the hard part. Once you start paying attention, you can't unsee what you find. You notice the ways you lie to yourself, the excuses you make, the patterns you keep repeating. You see your flaws in high definition. And unlike the vague sense of imperfection most people carry around, this is specific, detailed, undeniable. Most people spend enormous energy avoiding this confrontation. They stay busy. They blame others. They create elaborate justifications for their behavior. Because facing your actual self, not the idealized version, is one of the most painful things a person can do. It means admitting that you're not always the hero of your own story. Sometimes you're the obstacle. Sometimes you're the villain. And that realization doesn't feel like growth. It feels like failure. But here's what nobody tells you about self-knowledge. Seeing your flaws clearly isn't the same as being defined by them. In fact, it's the opposite. When you can look at a pattern without drowning in shame, you create space for change. When you can say, yes, I do that, and I understand why, you're no longer at war with yourself. You're finally in a position to make different choices. Think about the parts of yourself you try hardest to hide. The jealousy you'd never admit to. The pettiness that shows up when you feel threatened. The ways you manipulate situations to get what you want while convincing yourself you're being reasonable. These shadow parts don't disappear when you ignore them. They run your life from the basement. They make decisions you don't consciously approve of. They sabotage the things you claim to want most. Everyone has these parts. The difference is whether you're willing to look at them or not. Most people aren't. It's too threatening to their self-image. They need to believe they're good people, so they exile anything that contradicts that story. But those exiled parts don't vanish. They grow stronger in the dark. They leak out in passive-aggressive comments, in inexplicable mood swings, in patterns you keep repeating even though you swear you'll stop. The irony is that acknowledging your shadow doesn't make you a worse person. It makes you a more honest one. Because pretending you're all light doesn't fool anyone. People can feel your shadow even when you're hiding it. They just can't name it. And that creates a strange dynamic where everyone's performing goodness while their shadows dance behind them, visible to everyone except themselves. True self-knowledge means dragging these parts into the light, not to judge them, but to understand them. Every behavior, no matter how destructive, is trying to meet a need. Maybe it's trying to keep you safe. Maybe it's trying to get you love. Maybe it's replaying old strategies that worked once, but don't anymore. When you can see the need beneath the behavior, you stop being a mystery to yourself. You start to make sense. But self-knowledge isn't just an internal process. It's deeply complicated by the fact that you don't exist in isolation. You exist in relationship. And relationships require masks. Not because you're being fake, but because context matters. The version of you that shows up at work is different from the version that shows up with family. The self you present to strangers is different from the self you share with your closest friend. And none of these versions is more real than the others. They're all true. They're all you. This is where things get exhausting, because maintaining these different versions takes energy. You have to remember what you've shared with whom. You have to shift your language, your posture, your energy, depending on who's in the room. And if you're someone who feels things deeply, someone who processes the world through emotion and intuition, this constant adaptation can feel like losing yourself piece by piece. The psychology of knowing yourself includes understanding this tension, the gap between your inner world and the face you show the world. For some people, this gap is small. They're able to be mostly authentic in most situations. But for others, especially those who've learned that their true self isn't always welcome, the gap becomes a chasm. They develop an external persona that's charming, capable, easy to be around. And inside they're drowning. This is why solitude becomes sacred. Not loneliness, but chosen aloneness. time where you don't have to perform any version of yourself for anyone, where you can let the mask drop and just exist without explanation. For people who live largely in their heads, who spend most of their energy managing their internal weather, solitude isn't an escape, it's a restoration. It's the only place where all the scattered parts of themselves can come back together. Think about what happens after a long day of being around people. You come home and feel completely drained, not because the interactions were bad, but because you've been holding yourself in a certain shape all day, monitoring your words, managing your expressions, making sure you're coming across the right way. And all of that takes energy that most people don't even realize they're spending. This exhaustion is real. It's not a weakness or a flaw in your personality. It's what happens when your inner world is rich and complex, but the outer world demands simplicity. When you feel everything deeply but have to pretend you're fine. When you're processing layers of meaning that others don't see. The gap between what's happening inside you and what you can show creates friction. And that friction is tiring. So when you finally get time alone, it's not about isolation. It's about integration. All those pieces of yourself you had to tuck away come back out. The thoughts you couldn't share, the feelings you had to postpone, the questions you've been carrying. In solitude, you don't have to translate anymore. You don't have to make yourself digestible. You can just be the full, complicated version of yourself without apology. And in that quiet, something interesting happens. You start to notice what's actually yours and what you've absorbed from the world around you. The beliefs that came from your parents, the fears that came from your culture, the expectations that came from people who don't even know you. When you're constantly in the presence of others, these borrowed ideas blend into your identity. But in solitude, they start to separate, and you get to choose what to keep and what to release. This is where true self-knowledge becomes an act of creation, because you're not just discovering who you are. You're deciding who you want to be. You're taking all the raw material of your personality, your history, your potential, and shaping it into something intentional. And that's much harder than just accepting whatever story you've been handed. It requires you to sit with paradox, to accept that you can be strong and vulnerable, logical and emotional, independent and deeply connected. Most people try to resolve these contradictions by picking a side. They decide they're one thing and suppress everything that doesn't fit. But wholeness comes from integration, not amputation. The thing is, most of us were taught to be consistent, to have one clear identity that makes sense to everyone. But life isn't consistent. Your needs change depending on the situation. Your feelings shift with context. The way you show up in one relationship might be completely different from how you show up in another. And that's not being fake. That's being fully human. Consider how you behave when you feel safe versus when you feel threatened. When you're around people who genuinely see you versus people who've already decided who you are. The differences are massive, and each version is real. Each one is you, responding authentically to different environments. The question isn't which one is the true you, it's whether you can recognize all of them as part of the same complex system. This kind of complexity is uncomfortable. It's easier to have a simple story. These labels provide clarity. They give you an identity you can explain to others, but they also become a cage. Because once you've decided who you are, you stop noticing all the ways you're changing. You miss the moments where you could grow into something new because you're too busy protecting the story you've already written. Real self-knowledge is fluid. It understands that you're not a fixed entity. You're a process, a constant becoming. And the person you are today is different from the person you were last year. Even if the differences are subtle, your wounds shift, your desires evolve, your understanding deepens, and if you're paying attention, you get to participate in that evolution instead of just being carried along by it. This fluidity is both liberating and deeply terrifying. Liberating because it means you're never stuck. No matter how deeply you've identified with a particular version of yourself, you can change. You can outgrow old patterns and beliefs. You can become someone you barely recognize and have it feel like coming home. But it's also terrifying because it means there's no solid ground, no final answer to the question of who you are. But here's the catch. The more you know yourself, the lonelier it can feel, because true self-knowledge reveals how different you are from the people around you, how your mind works in ways that don't match the standard template, how your emotional landscape is more complex than the simple categories most people use. And when you try to explain this to someone who hasn't done the same internal work, it's like speaking a language they don't understand. You start a conversation about something meaningful to you and watch their eyes glaze over. Or worse, they respond with a platitude that completely misses what you were trying to say. Not because they don't care, but because they're operating from a different level of awareness. They're still living in the story. You're trying to talk about the space between the words. And there's no bridge across that gap unless they've walked the same path. This creates a strange kind of isolation. You're surrounded by people, participating in normal life but feeling fundamentally alone in your experience. Like you're watching everyone from behind glass. You can see them, interact with them, even care about them deeply, but you can't quite reach them. And they can't quite reach you, because the version of reality you're living in has different rules, different depths, different possibilities. This is the hidden cost of depth, the price you pay for refusing to live on the surface. You gain clarity, wisdom, a profound sense of self, but you also gain distance, because intimacy requires being understood, and being understood requires finding people who've traveled similar internal terrain. And those people are rare, so you learn to translate. To find ways of sharing your inner world that don't overwhelm or alienate. You get better at meeting people where they are, while still honoring where you are. And sometimes, when you're lucky, you find someone who speaks your language, someone who doesn't need translation. Those connections become lifelines, proof that depth doesn't have to mean isolation, that knowing yourself doesn't mean losing the ability to be known. But even in those relationships, there's a part of you that remains solitary, a part that no one else can fully access. And learning to be okay with that, to be your own best company, is its own form of self-knowledge. This journey inward also reveals something else, the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is about accumulating knowledge, solving problems, understanding systems. Wisdom is about knowing what matters, about seeing clearly through your own psychological noise to what's actually true. And that clarity doesn't come from books or conversations or external teachers. It comes from the willingness to sit with your own life until the lessons reveal themselves. You can read every psychology book ever written and still not understand yourself. You can analyze your patterns, dissect your childhood, map your triggers. But intellectual understanding isn't the same as embodied wisdom. Wisdom happens when you stop trying to think your way through everything and start actually feeling what's true. When you let your body tell you what your mind keeps trying to rationalize away. This is uncomfortable territory for people who live in their heads, because feeling things fully means losing control. It means sitting with emotions that don't have solutions. grief that won't be reasoned away. Joy that feels almost too intense to bear. Anger that reveals truths you'd rather not see. Your mind wants to categorize all of this, to make it make sense. But wisdom knows that some things don't need to make sense. They just need to be experienced. Wisdom understands that control is an illusion, that you can't think your way out of every problem. That sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is stop trying to figure it all out and just let yourself be uncertain. It knows that meaning isn't something you find, it's something you create. And that creation requires vulnerability, courage, the willingness to build something beautiful even though it won't last forever. Because nothing lasts. Not feelings, not circumstances, not even the self you've worked so hard to understand. Everything changes. And the psychology of knowing yourself includes accepting this impermanence. Holding your identity lightly, being willing to let old versions of yourself die when they've served their purpose, trusting that something new will emerge from the space they leave behind. This is why self-knowledge is less like reaching a destination and more like learning to surf. You're not trying to control the waves. You're learning to move with them, to stay balanced in motion, to find grace in uncertainty. And the better you get at this, the less you need external validation to know you're on the right path. Because the path is you. It always has been. The invisible map you've been searching for doesn't exist outside you. It's not hidden in a book or a practice or another person's wisdom. It's woven into your own experience, into every choice you've made, every pattern you've repeated, every moment you've paid attention. And the more you learn to read that map, the more you realize it's not leading you somewhere. It's showing you where you already are. This is the paradox at the heart of self-knowledge. The journey to know yourself doesn't take you anywhere new. It brings you home, to the awareness that was always there, beneath the noise, to the part of you that's been watching this whole time, steady and clear, waiting for you to notice it was there. And when you finally do, everything shifts. Not because you've become someone different, but because you finally stopped pretending to be someone you're not. You've stepped out of the story and into the truth. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, becomes the foundation for everything else. For real relationships, for meaningful work, for a life that feels like yours instead of a performance you're trapped inside. But let's be honest. This level of self-knowledge isn't for everyone. It requires you to give up comfort for clarity, to trade easy answers for harder questions, to sit in the fire of your own contradictions until something new emerges. Most people won't make that trade. They'll stay on the surface, where things are simpler and safer. And there's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone is built for depth, but if you are, if you've always felt like there's something more beneath the surface of your experience, then this journey is inevitable. You can delay it, distract yourself from it, pretend you don't hear the call. But eventually, life will force the question, who are you really? Not who you've been told to be, not who you wish you were, who you actually are right now in all your messy, complicated, contradictory truth. And when you're ready to answer that question honestly, without sugarcoating or self-deception, that's when the real work begins. That's when you stop being a stranger to yourself, when you start building a relationship with the person you've been avoiding. When you finally understand that knowing yourself isn't about achieving some perfect version of self-awareness, it's about showing up to your own life with honesty and compassion. It's about seeing yourself clearly and choosing to stay anyway. Because at the end of all this psychological excavation, all this introspection and analysis and questioning, you arrive at something surprisingly simple. You're human. Beautifully, frustratingly human. Full of potential and limitation. Capable of profound love and petty cruelty. Wise in some areas, completely clueless in others. And none of that makes you broken. It makes you real. The invisible map you've been following leads here, to acceptance. Not the passive kind that gives up on growth, but the active kind that sees clearly and chooses kindness, that understands your flaws without being defined by them, that recognizes your gifts without inflating them. That makes space for all of it, the light and shadow, the strength and fragility, the certainty and doubt. This is what the psychology of knowing yourself ultimately offers. Not a perfect understanding of who you are, but a lived practice of being with who you are, of staying curious instead of defensive, of treating your inner world like territory worth exploring instead of a problem to solve, of recognizing that depth isn't about drowning in thought. It's about seeing clearly enough to float. So here's the invitation. Stop waiting to become someone worthy of knowing. You already are. Start paying attention to the person you are right now, the one reading these words, the one carrying questions you haven't asked yet, the one who feels too much and thinks too deeply and doesn't quite fit into the boxes the world provides. That person deserves your curiosity, your kindness, your attention. And who knows? Maybe in learning to see yourself clearly, you'll finally understand what you've been looking for all along. Not a better version of who you are, but permission to be exactly this. Complicated and contradictory and completely, imperfectly human. That's not failure. That's the whole point. If this resonated with you, if you felt that pull toward deeper self-understanding, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more content that explores the messy truth of being human. And drop a comment below. What's one thing you've learned about yourself recently that surprised you? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.